The wind howls, floodwaters rise, and amid the chaos, a man faces a critical decision: stay safe with his family or risk the electrified waters to save his racist neighbor. Panic engulfs the coastal town as residents rush to prepare for the hurricane. Cars filled with belongings clog the streets while others hurriedly board up windows. Fear is visible on every face. In contrast, Ethan and his family calmly work to secure their home. A former military man with construction expertise, Ethan exudes confidence as he fortifies doors and windows, while his wife Nora assists, though her anxious glances reveal her unease. Their decision to stay, based on Ethan's skills and their thorough preparations, makes them stand out from their fleeing neighbors. As they finish, a serious-faced news anchor appears on the TV. "This hurricane is unprecedented in strength," she warns, her voice thick with urgency. "All residents must evacuate immediately." The family exchanges concerned looks as the storm's true severity becomes clear. As Ethan secures the last window, he notices his neighbor, Mr. Carmichael, struggling with his own preparations. The contrast between the two men is stark. Ethan composed and efficient, while Carmichael fumbles with boards and nails. For a moment, Ethan hesitates. He's aware of Carmichael's reputation in the neighborhood, but his instinct to help overcomes his reservations. "Need a hand there, Mr. Carmichael?" Ethan calls out as he approaches the property line. Carmichael's head jerks up, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Ethan's extended hand. The old man's face contorts into a sneer, his voice laced with disdain. "I don't need any help from your kind." The words hang in the air, heavy and venomous. Ethan feels the sting, his shoulders tensing as he processes the blatant racism. For a brief moment, he contemplates walking away, leaving Carmichael to deal with the storm alone. But something holds him back, a mix of shock and determination. "Mr. Carmichael, this storm is serious. We should all be working together." Ethan tries again, his voice steady despite the simmering anger. Carmichael turns his back, deliberately ignoring him as he clumsily secures a loose shutter. "I said I don't want your help. Now get off my property before I call the police." Ethan steps back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He surveys Carmichael's house, noticing the gaps in the boards and the unsecured objects that could turn into dangerous projectiles in the hurricane. A sense of dread washes over him. Carmichael's stubbornness and hatred could cost him his life. As Ethan heads back to his home, his mind races. He's dealt with racism before, but never in a situation where lives were at risk. The weight of the looming disaster and Carmichael's hostility weighs heavily on his shoulders. Nora meets him at the door, her brow furrowed with concern. "What happened? I saw you talking to Carmichael." Ethan shakes his head, his voice tight, as he recounts the encounter. Nora's eyes flash with anger, but she gently places a hand on his arm. "Ignore him, Ethan. We can't waste energy on his hatred right now. We need to focus on keeping our families safe." Their children peek around the corner, sensing the tension. Ethan forces a smile, pushing his frustration aside for their sake. "Everything's okay, kids. Let's do one last check of our supplies." As the family moves through the house, double-checking their preparations, Ethan can't shake the persistent worry about Carmichael. He finds himself glancing out the window, watching as the old man fumbles with his inadequate defenses. Nora notices him looking and squeezes his hand. "You can't save everyone, Ethan, especially those who don't want to be saved." Ethan nods, but the internal conflict is evident in his eyes. He knows Nora is right, but the idea of leaving anyone unprepared for the hurricane goes against everything he stands for. The moral dilemma gnaws at him even as he refocuses on his family. Outside, the wind begins to pick up, whistling ominously through the trees. Dark clouds gather on the horizon, mirroring the tension growing between the two neighboring houses. As Ethan secures the last window, he takes one final look at Carmichael's property. The old man has gone inside, leaving behind a patchwork of incomplete preparations. Ethan closes the shutters with a heavy sigh. He's done everything he can for his family. They're as prepared as they can be for whatever the storm brings. But as he turns away from the window, something catches his eye. Through a gap in Carmichael's poorly boarded windows, he sees the old man pacing, fear evident in his jerky movements. For a moment, Ethan is torn. The rational part of his mind tells him to focus only on his family's safety, but his conscience whispers that abandoning Carmichael, despite his prejudice, feels wrong. As the first raindrops begin to fall, Ethan realizes that the true test of his character may not be the storm itself, but how he handles the human drama unfolding next door. The patter of rain soon turns into a deafening roar. While Ethan wrestles with his moral dilemma, an even greater threat looms. How will his family's resolve be tested when their carefully fortified home begins to fail them? The sky darkens to an ominous charcoal gray as the hurricane's outer bands lash the town. The wind howls through the streets, gaining strength with each passing minute. Inside, Ethan and his family huddle together, listening to the storm's growing intensity. "It's worse than they predicted," Nora murmurs, her eyes fixed on the rattling windows. Ethan nods, his jaw set with determination. "We're ready for this. Our preparations will hold." But as the minutes pass, the family's confidence starts to wane. The wind's wails reach a fever pitch, drowning out every other sound. Rain slams into the house in relentless sheets, driven sideways by gusts that shake the very foundation. Their children, brave at first, now cling to Nora. The youngest whimpers softly, frightened by a loud crash outside. Ethan moves to comfort them, his unease hidden behind a mask of calm reassurance. "Remember what we practiced," he says, his voice steady. "If things get worse, we move to the interior bathroom. That's the safest place in the house." Suddenly, the lights flicker, once, twice, and then the house is plunged into darkness. The sudden loss of power is unsettling, heightening the family's vulnerability. Ethan immediately springs into action, feeling around in the dark for the flashlight they had kept nearby. "I'll start the generator," he says, his silhouette briefly illuminated by a flash of lightning. "Nora, can you grab the emergency lanterns?" As Ethan makes his way to the garage, the storm's fury seems to increase. The generator sputters to life, restoring a semblance of normalcy as the lights flicker back on throughout the house. But the relief doesn't last long. A low gurgling sound catches Ethan's attention as he re-enters the living room. His eyes widen as he sees water seeping under the front door, forming a growing puddle on the floor. "No, no, no," he mutters, rushing to check the other entry points. To his dismay, water is creeping in from multiple spots, defying all their careful preparations. "Ethan," Nora shouts, her voice tight with worry. "The back door, it's coming in here too." The family springs into action, grabbing towels, blankets, and anything else to stop the water. Ethan directs their efforts, his military training kicking in as he assesses the situation. "We need to move everything important to higher ground," he orders, already lifting a box of documents. "Kids, grab what you can and take it upstairs." As they work quickly to save their belongings, the water continues to rise. What began as a trickle is now a steady stream, the flood breaching new entry points with every passing minute. Ethan pauses for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. He glances out the window, squinting through the rain-smeared glass, and his eyes widen in shock. Next door, Mr. Carmichael's house is in trouble. A massive tree torn up by the hurricane's fierce winds has crashed through the roof. Even from this distance, Ethan can see that the old man's house is rapidly falling apart. For a brief moment, Ethan is torn. His family needs him. Their home is being overwhelmed by the flood. But Carmichael, stubborn and prejudiced as he is in real danger. Before Ethan can wrestle further with this moral dilemma, a loud crack resounds through their home. A window in the kitchen has given way under the storm's relentless assault, allowing in a torrent of wind and rain. "To the bathroom," Ethan shouts, gathering his family. As they rush to their designated safe space, Ethan can't help but glance one last time at Carmichael's crumbling house. The ethical conflict weighs heavily on him, even as he focuses on keeping his family safe. The bathroom door slams shut, sealing the family inside their makeshift refuge. But as water begins to seep under the door, Ethan realizes that their sanctuary may soon become a trap. Can they outlast a storm determined to flood everything in its path? Ethan stares at the expanding puddle on the bathroom floor, his mind racing. Their carefully laid plans are unraveling faster than he can adjust. Nora meets his gaze, her face a mix of fear and resolve. "What now?" she asks, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. He takes a deep breath, steadying himself. "We need to move higher. The second floor might give us some time." Ethan turns to his children, forcing a reassuring smile. "Okay, team, we're going on an adventure. Who can grab the most important things in 1 minute? The kids, eager for distractions, spring into action. Ethan and Nora gather essentials, flashlights, batteries, and their emergency radio. As they prepare to leave the bathroom, a loud crack echoes through the house. What was that? Nora whispers, clutching their youngest child. Ethan peers out of the bathroom and his eyes widen. A large section of the living room ceiling has collapsed, allowing in a deluge of rain. The floodwaters are rising even faster now, already ankle-deep in their once secure home. We move now, Ethan commands, his military instincts taking over. Stay close, watch your step. They form a human chain, with Ethan leading and Nora bringing up the rear. The trek to the stairs is perilous, with debris floating in the water and hidden hazards under the murky flood. Every step feels like a calculated risk. Halfway across the living room, Ethan freezes. Through the broken window, he catches sight of Carmichael's house. The situation next door has deteriorated quickly. The fallen tree has ripped a huge hole in the roof, and Carmichael's home is visibly buckling under the storm's onslaught. For a moment, Ethan feels conflicted. His family needs him, but the sight of Carmichael's collapsing house tugs at his conscience. He remembers the old man's hateful words and years of thinly veiled racism. Still, the thought of leaving someone to face this nightmare alone weighs heavily on his heart. Sensing his inner turmoil, Nora tugs at his arm. Ethan, we can't help him. We barely have a chance ourselves. He nods, regaining focus on the task at hand. They reach the stairs, a small victory in their fight against the rising waters. As they ascend, Ethan can't shake the image of Carmichael in danger. The second floor offers brief relief. The water hasn't reached this height yet, but the howling wind and rain outside serve as a grim reminder that their reprieve won't last long. Ethan guides the family to the master bedroom, away from windows that could shatter under the storm's assault. "Dad, look," his daughter says, pointing out the window, her voice shaking. Ethan follows her gaze, his heart sinking. Carmichael's house is falling apart fast. From this distance, Ethan can see the walls bowing and the roof sagging. Through the wreckage, Carmichael is barely visible, pinned by debris, terror etched on his face. The moral dilemma Ethan has been struggling with becomes clear. He turns to his family, seeing the question in their eyes before they can ask it. "I have to try," he says softly. Nora grips his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, no, it's too dangerous. The kids need you here." He cups her face gently, speaking quietly but firmly. "I know, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try. Carmichael may be a hateful old man, but no one deserves to die like this." The children, understanding the weight of the moment, stay silent. Ethan kneels to meet their eyes. "I need you to be brave for a little while longer. Help your mom, and I promise I'll be back soon." As Ethan prepares to step out into the storm, the full danger of the situation becomes clear. Their once quiet street has transformed into a raging river. Debris, pieces of homes, cars, and trees uprooted by the storm floats past. He turns back one last time, locking the image of his family in his mind. The fear in their eyes is mixed with pride and love. Taking a deep breath, Ethan steps out onto the balcony, immediately assaulted by the wind and rain. Ethan stands on the balcony, the storm battering him with relentless force. He squints through the downpour, trying to find the safest route to Carmichael's crumbling house. Just as he braces himself to take that first crucial step, a blinding flash illuminates the sky, followed by a deafening boom. The ground shakes beneath him. For a moment, Ethan is frozen, his mind racing to comprehend what just happened. Then, with growing horror, he realizes a massive electrical explosion has rocked the neighborhood, sending sparks flying and power lines crashing into the floodwaters below. "Ethan!" Nora's panicked voice cuts through the chaos. "What was that?" He rushes back inside, his heart pounding. The family huddles together, fear evident in their wide eyes as Ethan explains. The storm knocked out the power grid. There are live wires in the water now. The children cling to Nora, pale with fear. Ethan continues, his voice grim. "We're not just dealing with flooding anymore. The water's electrified. One wrong step could be fatal." Nora gasps, her hand flying to her mouth. "But we can't stay here. The water's still rising. What are we going to do?" Ethan paces, his mind racing. The flood has trapped them on the second floor, but now the electrified water makes any escape attempt even more dangerous. He glances out the window toward Carmichael's house, knowing the old man's situation has become even more dire. "We need to think this through carefully," Ethan says, forcing calm into his voice for his family's sake. "The water isn't up here yet. We still have time to come up with a plan." But even as he speaks, a faint crackling sound reaches their ears. The family falls silent, listening. Ethan moves to the window, peering out into the storm-ravaged street. What he sees chills him. Sparks dance across the floodwater, creating an eerie, almost beautiful display of deadly electricity. The crackling grows louder as more power lines fall into the water, spreading the danger further. "Dad." His daughter's voice trembles. "Are we going to die?" Ethan kneels beside her, looking into her frightened eyes. "No, we're not. We're smart, we're prepared, and we're together. We'll find a way out." But even as he says it, Ethan feels the weight of their predicament pressing down on him. They are trapped between rising, electrified waters and the fierce storm above. Every escape route is filled with danger. Nora meets his gaze, her eyes reflecting the same mix of determination and fear. "What about Carmichael?" she asks softly, surprising Ethan with her concern for the man who had shown them nothing but disdain. Ethan sighs. "I don't know. His situation is worse than ours. But right now, we have to focus on staying safe. If we can't do that, we can't help anyone." The family lapses into tense silence. Only the wind and the crackling electricity outside fill the room. Ethan moves from window to window, assessing their options, looking for any sign of rescue or a safe path out. But all he sees is danger. The floodwaters continue to rise, carrying debris from destroyed homes and vehicles. The downed power lines have turned the flood into a deadly electric trap. As Ethan watches, a tree branch touches a submerged power line. There's a bright flash and a loud pop as the wood catches fire, burning even as it floats on the water. The sight drives home the lethal nature of their situation. "Okay," Ethan says, turning back to his family. "We need to gather everything we might need. Blankets, water, any food we have up here. We'll move to the highest point of the house and wait this out." As they begin gathering supplies, a new sound cuts through the storm. A low, ominous creaking, followed by a tremendous crash. Ethan rushes to the window, his heart sinking. Carmichael's house has finally collapsed, sinking into the electrified flood. The moral dilemma Ethan had been grappling with now looms larger than ever. Carmichael is likely trapped or injured, facing certain death without help. But any rescue now seems like suicide. Just as Ethan struggles with his impossible choice, fate throws him a curveball. A frantic pounding at the door breaks through the storm's howl. Who else could be out there? And what new danger might they bring? The family freezes, exchanging shocked looks. Nora's eyes widen with concern. "Ethan, someone's out there." Ethan cautiously approaches the door, his mind racing. Opening it risks their fragile safety, but leaving someone to face the storm alone seems unthinkable. He peers through the peephole, barely able to make out the figures huddled on their porch. "It's the Martins from down the street," he says, recognizing them. "They're soaked to the bone." Nora rushes to his side. "We have to let them in, Ethan. They'll die out there." Ethan hesitates, torn between compassion and caution. "Nora, we're barely hanging on ourselves. More people means more risk, more mouths to feed." The pounding becomes more frantic. Through the door they hear muffled cries for help and a child's sobs. "Please," a woman's voice pleads, desperation clear even through the storm. "Our house is gone. We have nowhere else to go." Ethan looks at his children huddled together, watching him with wide eyes. They are waiting to see what he will do. With a heavy sigh, Ethan unlocks the door, bracing against the wind as he opens it. The Martins stumble in, drenched and shivering. "Thank you," Sarah breathes, clutching Emma close. "We thought we were going to die." As Nora fetches towels, Ethan surveys their new guests. Caleb Martin, usually jovial, is pale, his eyes haunted. Little Emma clings to her mother, shaking with silent sobs. "What happened?" Ethan asks, helping Caleb to a chair. Caleb's voice trembles. "The water rose so fast. We didn't have time. We made it to the roof, but then the power lines fell. The street lit up like fireworks. We had to get out, but everywhere was dangerous." Sarah continues, her words rushed. "We saw your lights. It was the only place that looked safe. We didn't know where else to go." Ethan nods, understanding their terror, but as he looks around the room another worry takes root. Their carefully rationed supplies now have to stretch even further. If the water keeps rising, they might not stay safe for long. Nora returns with towels and dry clothes, her face a mask of quiet determination. "Let's get you warmed up," she says, guiding Emma to the bathroom. As the Martins settle in, Ethan pulls Nora aside. "We need to talk," he murmurs. "I know," Nora says quietly. "But we couldn't leave them out there, Ethan. It wouldn't be right." Ethan runs a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying it wasn't right, but Nora, we have to be realistic. Our food, our water, it's all going to run out faster now, and if things get worse..." He trails off, not wanting to voice his darkest fears. Nora squeezes his hand. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Their moment of quiet is interrupted by a sudden shout from the window. "Dad, look!" Their son cries, pointing outside. Ethan rushes over, his heart sinking. The floodwaters have risen higher, now reaching the base of their porch. Sparks dance across the surface of the water, lighting up the devastation around them. A piece of debris floats past, a familiar-looking mailbox. With a jolt, Ethan realizes it's from Mr. Carmichael's house. The old man's home has been swallowed by the churning, electrified flood. The burden of responsibility weighed heavily on Ethan, almost as if it were a tangible force. He now had 7 lives to protect, all stranded in a house that was quickly becoming an island surrounded by danger. Somewhere out there, a man who had only ever shown him disdain might be fighting for his life. Ethan turned to face the room, taking in the frightened faces that looked to him for leadership. He knew he had to appear confident, even though doubt and fear gnawed at him from the inside. "All right," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Let's take stock of what we have and make a plan. We're all in this together now." While Ethan focused on fortifying their refuge, another life teetered on the brink of disaster. In the face of certain doom, would a lifetime of prejudice crumble as quickly as the walls around him? The storm's fury intensified, its howling winds drowning out every other sound. Inside his crumbling home, Mr. Carmichael found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The massive tree that had crashed through his roof now pinned him to the floor, its weight pressing against his chest. Each labored breath sent pain shooting through his body. Carmichael's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an escape that didn't exist. Water seeped in from all directions, rising at a terrifying rate. The furniture he had so carefully maintained over the years now floated like driftwood in the murky floodwaters. In the dim light, he saw sparks dancing across the water's surface, a deadly reminder of the electrified danger that awaited him if he somehow freed himself. As the reality of his situation settled in, Carmichael felt a wave of regret wash over him. His mind flashed back to earlier that day, when Ethan had extended a hand to help. He had sneered at the offer, blinded by his pride and prejudice to the looming disaster. Now, as he lay trapped and alone, that moment of cruelty haunted him. The water continued to rise, inch by merciless inch. It reached Carmichael's chin, forcing him to crane his neck just to keep his face above the surface. Panic gripped him, overriding the years of stubborn independence. Faced with his own mortality, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Carmichael's lips trembled as he formed words he never thought he'd say. At first, it was barely a whisper, choked by pride and fear. But as the water rose higher, desperation took over. "Help," he croaked, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. "Somebody, please help me." The words echoed through the empty house, lost in the storm's relentless fury. Carmichael's cries grew louder, more frantic. Years of bitterness and isolation melted away in the face of sheer terror. "Ethan," he shouted, surprising himself with the name that slipped from his lips. "Ethan, I'm sorry. Please help me." Across the flooded street, in the relative safety of his fortified home, Ethan paused in his preparations. He cocked his head, straining to hear over the howling wind and pounding rain. There it was again, a faint cry, barely audible over the storm's roar. Ethan moved to the window, peering out into the chaos. Carmichael's house was barely visible through the deluge, and its structure was clearly compromised. As he watched, another section of the roof caved in, sending debris into the electrified floodwaters below. "Ethan?" Nora's voice was tinged with concern. "What is it?" He turned to her and the others, his expression grave. I think it's Carmichael. He's calling for help." The room fell into a tense silence. broken only by the constant barrage of the storm outside. The Martins exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Ethan's children looked to their father with a mixture of fear and expectation. Nora stepped closer, her voice low. "Ethan, you can't be thinking of going out there. It's suicide." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the conflict evident on his face. "I know, but, Nora, if that were me out there." "That man wouldn't lift a finger to help you," Caleb Martin interjected bitterly. "He's made it clear how he feels about us." Ethan nodded, acknowledging the truth in Caleb's words. But even as he did, another cry reached them, more desperate than before. "Please, anybody." The anguish in Carmichael's voice was unmistakable now. It pierced through Ethan's defenses, speaking to the part of him that believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. "I have to try," Ethan said quietly, his decision made. "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." Nora grabbed his arm, her eyes brimming with tears. "Ethan, please think of the children. Think of us. We need you here." He cupped her face gently, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I am thinking of them. I'm thinking of the example we set. What kind of man would I be if I left someone to die, no matter who they are or what they've done?" He turned to the group, his gaze resolute. "I'm going to need help. We'll have to be smart about this. The water out there is electrified and the current's strong. One wrong move and—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. As Ethan began to outline his rescue plan, the cries from across the street grew fainter. Time was running out. In the coming moments, Ethan would put his life on the line for a man who had shown him nothing but contempt. It was a test, not only of his physical skills and courage, but of the very core of his character. As the storm raged outside, an inner tempest swirled within Ethan. His next move would challenge his beliefs about humanity and forgiveness. Ethan stood at the window, his eyes fixed on the barely visible outline of Carmichael's collapsing house. The cries for help, once faint, now pierced the howling wind with desperate clarity. His hands clenched into fists as he wrestled with the weight of his decision. "You can't seriously be considering this," Nora pleaded, her voice trembling. "Think of our children, Ethan. They need you here." He turned to his family and the Martins, their faces a mix of fear and disbelief. "I know it's dangerous," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "But if I don't try, I'll have to live with that decision for the rest of my life." Caleb Martin stepped forward, his expression grim. "That man wouldn't even spit on you if you were on fire, Ethan. Why risk everything for someone like that?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because it's not about who he is or what he's done. It's about who we are and what we stand for." As if to punctuate the urgency, a loud crack echoed from across the street, followed by a fresh burst of panicked shouts. Ethan moved quickly, grabbing a length of rope and a powerful flashlight. Nora caught his arm as he headed for the door. "Ethan, please," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "We can't lose you." He pulled her close, pressing a fierce kiss to her forehead. "I'll come back," he promised. "I always do." With a final glance at his children, who looked at him with a mix of fear and pride, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped out into the raging storm. Ethan vanished into the tempest, leaving his family wondering if they would ever see him again. As he battled the elements, he would soon be confronted with a startling revelation, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his neighbor and about himself. The moment Ethan stepped outside, the full force of the hurricane hit him like a physical blow. Rain lashed his face, driven sideways by winds that threatened to knock him off his feet. He squinted through the downpour, barely able to make out Carmichael's house across the street. Ethan moved cautiously forward, each step a calculated risk. The floodwater swirled around his ankles, then his knees, hiding untold dangers beneath its murky surface. He swept his flashlight back and forth, searching for debris that could act as stepping stones. Suddenly, a flash lit up the scene, followed by a deafening crack. Ethan instinctively ducked as a power line whipped past, sparks flying as it hit the water. The acrid smell of ozone filled the air, a stark reminder of the electrified danger surrounding him. Carmichael's cries grew weaker, spurring Ethan to move faster. He pushed through the rising water, ignoring the burning in his muscles and the fear gnawing at his gut. A piece of fence floated by, and Ethan grabbed it, using it as a makeshift raft to navigate the treacherous current. As he neared Carmichael's property, the full extent of the damage became clear. The house was barely standing, its walls bowed and creaking under the relentless onslaught of wind and water. Ethan called out, straining to hear a response over the storm's roar. "Carmichael, where are you?" A weak voice answered from somewhere inside. Ethan steeled himself and plunged into the wreckage, mindful of the exposed wires and unstable debris. He found Carmichael pinned beneath a fallen beam, floodwaters lapping at his chin. Their eyes met, and in the old man's gaze, Ethan saw something unexpected. Vulnerability, fear, and a flicker of hope. The haughty disdain that had always defined their interactions was gone. You came," Carmichael croaked, his voice thick with disbelief and pain. Ethan didn't waste time on words. He braced himself against the beam, muscles straining as he tried to lift it. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't budge. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, it shifted just enough for Carmichael to wiggle free. No sooner had Ethan pulled Carmichael clear than a thunderous crack split the air. The wall beside them buckled, sending a cascade of debris crashing down. Ethan threw himself over Carmichael, shielding him with his own body as dust and splinters rained down around them. When the dust settled, Ethan helped Carmichael to his feet. The old man swayed, clearly injured and exhausted. Ethan slung Carmichael's arm over his shoulder, supporting most of his weight. "We need to move," Ethan shouted over the howling wind. This whole place could come down any second. They stumbled out of the ruined house into a world transformed by the storm's fury. The street was now a raging river, carrying chunks of debris that could crush a man. Sparks danced across the water's surface, a deadly light show illuminating the devastation around them. Ethan's mind raced, calculating their chances. The current was too strong to fight head-on, and the electrified water made every step a gamble with death. He scanned the chaos, searching for anything that could help them cross safely. A large piece of plywood bobbed nearby, caught on a partially submerged car. Ethan inched towards it, pulling Carmichael along. With shaking hands, he grabbed the makeshift raft and steadied it. "We'll use this to float across," he explained, helping Carmichael onto the plywood. "Stay low and don't touch the water, no matter what." Ethan pushed off, using a broken fence post as a pole to guide their precarious raft. The current immediately grabbed them, spinning them wildly. Ethan fought for control, his muscles screaming from the effort of keeping them afloat and away from the sparking danger all around. Carmichael clung to the plywood, his eyes wide with terror. For the first time, Ethan saw past the mask of bigotry to the frightened human beneath. In that moment, facing death together, the barriers between them crumbled. "I'm sorry," Carmichael choked out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "For everything, I was wrong about you." Ethan locked eyes with Carmichael, noticing the sincere regret reflected in his gaze. He gave a single nod, silently acknowledging the apology. Words could wait until later, if they managed to survive. A massive wave slammed into them, nearly overturning their makeshift raft. Ethan quickly shifted his weight to one side, barely keeping them from capsizing. They were halfway across now, but the water was rising rapidly, and the current grew stronger with each passing second. Ahead, Ethan's house loomed, offering a beacon of safety amidst the chaos. Yet, between them and their refuge lay a dangerous path filled with debris and sparking wires. One wrong step could send them into the electrified water. With a deep breath, Ethan steeled himself for the final stretch. He understood that the next few moments would decide whether their incredible journey ended in victory or catastrophe. Bursting through the front door, Ethan and Carmichael stumbled into the house, water dripping from their soaked bodies. The group inside let out a collective gasp, a mixture of relief and shock visible on their faces. Nora rushed forward, her eyes wide with concern as she took in the sight of her husband supporting the injured old man. "Ethan, oh my God, you're alive!" she exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion. She hurried to help, guiding them toward the living room couch. As they carefully lowered Carmichael onto the cushions, he groaned in pain. His clothes were torn and muddy, his face pale and drawn. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sounds the relentless wind outside and Carmichael's strained breathing. Nora, pushing her mixed emotions aside, quickly switched into caretaker mode. She retrieved a first aid kit and began tending to Carmichael's wounds with gentle but efficient hands. Ethan stood nearby, exhaustion etched into the slump of his shoulders. The children huddled together, watching with wide eyes. The Martins hovered in the background, uncertainty written across their faces. The air in the room was thick with unspoken questions and years of simmering resentment. As Nora cleaned a deep cut on Carmichael's forehead, his eyes fluttered open. He glanced around, momentarily disoriented, until his gaze settled on Ethan. For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across his features before he quickly looked away. "Thank you," Carmichael mumbled, his voice barely more than a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Ethan nodded silently, too worn out to respond verbally. He sank into a nearby chair, running a hand through his wet hair. The silence stretched, tense and uncomfortable. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for someone to address the unspoken tension in the room. It was Ethan and Nora's youngest child who finally broke the silence, her innocent curiosity cutting through the unease. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Carmichael. "Why didn't you help us before?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "Why were you always so mean to my daddy?" Her question landed like a clap of thunder. Carmichael's face crumpled, a mix of shame and regret clouding his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan started to intervene, but Carmichael raised a trembling hand to stop him. "No," he said softly. "She deserves an answer. They all do." Taking a deep breath, he winced at the pain in his ribs but pushed forward. I was wrong," he began, his voice shaking. "I've been wrong for a long time. I let fear and ignorance control me, and I hurt good people because of it." He looked toward Ethan, his eyes full of both regret and gratitude. "Your father," he continued, now addressing the children, "is a far better man than I ever was. He risked his life to save someone who didn't deserve it." The room fell into silence once again, the weight of Carmichael's words settling over everyone. Nora paused in her care for Carmichael, her gaze shifting between him and her husband. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "What matters is how we choose to move forward." Outside, the storm seemed to grow even more intense, as if nature itself was emphasizing the gravity of the moment. A loud crash echoed from outside, making everyone jump, a stark reminder of the ongoing threat beyond their walls. "We're not out of the woods yet," Ethan said, rising to his feet. "We need to stay alert and work together. There'll be time for more talk later." As the group shifted back to focusing on their immediate survival, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. In its place was a fragile sense of unity, born out of shared hardship and unexpected kindness. Carmichael watched as Ethan took charge, assigning tasks and offering comfort. The old man's gaze was filled with newfound respect, tinged with the bitter realization of what he had lost to prejudice. As Nora finished bandaging his wounds, Carmichael caught her eye. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice soft and sincere. "For everything." Nora nodded, her expression conflicted. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Carmichael," she replied. "But it's a start." As dawn broke over the ravaged landscape, a new scene unfolded, former adversaries now working side by side. Yet the question lingered. Would this newfound cooperation endure or crumble like the homes around them? The first rays of sunlight broke through the dissipating clouds, revealing the extent of the hurricane's destruction. Streets once lined with orderly homes now resembled a battlefield. Uprooted trees, overturned cars, and piles of debris littered the neighborhood. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered wood. As the wind calmed to a gentle breeze, doors creaked open and cautious faces peered out, eyes widening at the transformed world before them. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was written in every shattered window and collapsed roof. Ethan and his family stepped out of their damaged home, Carmichael leaning heavily on Ethan for support. They surveyed the scene in stunned silence. The neighborhood they had known for years was barely recognizable, but amid the wreckage, something new began to emerge. Across the street, the Martins were already clearing fallen branches from their yard. Without a word, Ethan's children ran to join them, their small hands pitching in to help. That simple act seemed to break the tension. Soon, more neighbors emerged, drawn by the sounds of activity and driven by the need to do something, anything, in the face of such devastation. Carmichael watched, his weathered face a mixture of emotions. "I never thought I'd see the day," he muttered to himself more than to Ethan. "Look at them, all working together." Ethan nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Carmichael's words. The storm had washed away more than just physical structures. Old walls of mistrust and prejudice had, for the moment, crumbled as well. As the morning wore on, a makeshift community center formed in the middle of the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged each other now shared water and words of comfort. The Rosens, a family Carmichael had once viewed with suspicion, were the first to offer their grill to cook whatever food could be salvaged from powerless refrigerators. Ethan and Carmichael worked side by side, clearing a path through the debris-strewn street. Their labor was punctuated by grunts of effort and occasional winces from Carmichael's injuries. Yet, an ease had settled between them that hadn't existed before, a shared purpose that transcended their past conflicts. "I was wrong about so many things," Carmichael suddenly said, pausing to catch his breath. Ethan stopped too, giving the older man his full attention. "It shouldn't have taken something like this to open my eyes, but, well, here we are." Ethan thought for a moment before responding. "It's never too late to change how you see things," he said. "What matters is what we do moving forward." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from down the street. A group of neighbors had discovered someone trapped in a car, pinned by a fallen telephone pole. Without hesitation, Ethan and Carmichael rushed to join the rescue effort. In that moment, race, age, and past grievances no longer mattered as they worked together to free the trapped driver. As the day progressed, small victories accumulated. Driveways were cleared, temporary shelters set up, and a system for sharing resources began to take shape. Though the devastation remained overwhelming, a tangible sense of hope started to build. Each cleared path and patched roof felt like a step toward reclaiming their lives. Despite his injuries, Carmichael insisted on helping. Ethan watched him, torn between respect and concern as the old man stubbornly pushed himself. It was clear that Carmichael was motivated by more than just the need to rebuild. He sought redemption, one small act of kindness at a time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the altered landscape, the community gathered for an impromptu meeting. Plans were made, tasks assigned, and a shared purpose took hold. Ethan found himself naturally taking a leadership role, his calm demeanor and organizational skills standing out. Carmichael lingered at the edge of the group, listening intently. When Ethan mentioned the need for temporary housing for those whose homes were uninhabitable, Carmichael spoke up. "I've got space," he offered, his voice gruff but sincere. "My place can hold a few families, at least until we figure something out." Surprised looks followed his offer, along with murmurs of appreciation. Ethan caught Carmichael's eye and nodded, recognizing the importance of the gesture. It was a small step, but a meaningful one.